Hi, this is Akash.
Sayantan here, and this is Fans or Fanatics.
So, in the last episode, we were discussing about how the book Seduction of the Innocent, written by an American psychiatrist, Frederick Wortham, that was published in 1954, changed the course of comic book history. So, let's pick it up from where we left off, shall we?
So that is something, right? Whenever you have a new medium growing up, evolving, you have the older generation a little, scared about what is coming. Yeah, the conservative approach comes up. So you had that against when rock as a music was growing up.
Yeah.
You have that now when we have social media growing up. So similarly, that during that time when you find comic books becoming more popular among the kids, and those early comic books did not hold back. So you had Batman going around and killing people, and there you had Superman making very socialist political statements. I think one of the first issues of Action Comics, which is Superman's comic book, was him fighting against the landlord. So you had very strong political undertones, and you had violence. And even then, there was a different comic book market for teenagers and adults. So EC Comics was a company. They used to have sci-fi and horror comic books, which were very much violent and gory details. And I don't know, maybe the older generation felt that this is something which is badly influencing people. Of course, you have to think about the time period. During that time, anti-communist hysteria was going on. You had those communist witch hunts were going on. So you wouldn't want your kid reading Superman and getting this anti-capitalist ideas. Plus, you had some what many felt were objectionable horror and violence in the pages of EC Comics. Even Batman and Robin were not spared. They used to like Batman and Robin going around just having adventures, beating up criminals. But even then, people felt that there was some homosexual undertones in those stories.
Yeah.
And so that's when the person Akash talked about, he came out with the book, The Seduction of the Innocent. So as you can understand from the name itself, he was like very clear about where he stood about comic books, and that went up, that created a lot of impact. And so to save themselves, the comic books and the government, like they came up with the Comic Code Authority. So
Yeah.
basically, that was like you may say a rating,
Self
like yeah,
self censorship. That was
it
like
was
a self
state
censorship.
censorship. Yeah, so you only get approved if you have a certain kind of stories and you leave out certain kind of stories. And I think that was something like we were discussing that day, Akash. I think like any kind of censorship is bad.
Any that Dr. Wortham came out and said children were becoming delinquents because of comic books. Like it was promoting violence among children, and he came and said ki it was in his book. He said the children were being exposed to something that was scientifically not right. That was disobeying the laws of physics by they are seeing Superman fly, which is not possible according to the laws of physics, like the way he flew. And they were saying that Wonder Woman was portrayed in such a way that gave a wrong impression to the little girls about their place in the society. And as you said, Batman and Robin were said to be promoting homosexual thoughts in the minds of children. And at that point of time, homosexuality was, I think, still criminalized, if I'm not wrong. So what happened was Comic Code Authority came in and they issued strict guidelines. Like it wasn't something imposed by the government as such. It was something that was done by the major comic book publication, fearing a backlash from the government. So it was like we would censor ourselves. We would have a board and we will censor ourselves so that you can buy whatever we sell with this stamp of approval that it has been approved by the censor board. And they had a strict set of laws, some of which over the top of my head that I remember were like in every instance like good shall triumph over evil. Like you can't have a story where the evil wins, okay? Like if a crime is depicted, it shouldn't be glorified in any way. Like female shall be drawn realistically without exaggeration of a physical any physical qualities. I think which was very predominant. I think that you were talking about the origin of Wonder Woman and some of her initial comics, right? So we were talking about how women were basically objectified. It was aimed at a demographic that were basically teenage boys. Wonder Woman was essentially created by William Martson and H.G. Peters, right? So William Martson is, or rather was, basically a pervert. He was an American psychologist who later went on to invent the earliest prototype of polygraphic tests that we know today as a lie detector test. He was one of the psychologists who created the earliest prototype of that, and he was essentially a pervert who fulfilled his like sexual desires through this character of Wonder Woman, which really reflected on the pages. Wonder Woman was shown in comics like as someone who was often part of like bondage and all those things that weren't really like uplifting the woman. So, but as I was saying lastly, any form of censorship is detrimental to art in the long run, because I think if somebody wants to say something through whatever means, maybe by making a movie or making a music or painting a picture, if you're censoring it, you're trying to rewrite history. You're trying to block out a section of the society, because when somebody wants to make something, wants to express something, it is not just his idea. He is representing a group of people who shares those ideas. So he is a representative who is expressing those things in the form of art and music, right? uh, so when you are censoring it, you are trying to block a part of history. You're trying to erase certain segments from history, and I think that is not something that you want, right?
Anyway, yeah, so people should have choice on what they want to consume. If something is bad, I think we should trust the society that they will themselves push that out and pull good things in. But like censoring things, you're actually stopping people from expressing certain facts, and whether they may be good or bad, censorship hurts the way of thinking. So as we can see, like during that time, let's take the example of comic books only, which is so comic books, the stories which they told during that time were simply put were fun. Like right now, if we go back, we can look at them like curiosities maybe, but that's not something which we would like love to read. So it was
True.
very much childish, and maybe a kid would love it.
That was, I think, the result of this huge ordeal that
With
happened
the
with the
Yeah,
comic
so
book
comic
code.
because
code.
you did not have like whenever you wanted to tell a good story, right? Like you always have to think that no, I can't say this, I can't show this. So that was detrimental to the art. It was detrimental to the story which they want to tell, and that is something which that era and the comic books that came out during that era were hugely like contributed hugely to the misconception which we have of comic book being for kids.
Let's say that they didn't really age well. Like you had Batman fighting sharks and Batmites, and Superman, because all his villains were so dark and gory, because Superman is an overpowered character, right? So you need villains who are like really monstrous creatures, and the censorship didn't allow stories to be told featuring those characters, like because they were representations of demons and vampires, things like that. So it prevented that from happening. So Superman were left with fighting enemies which were basically different color shades of kryptonites. Like there were red kryptonites, there were orange kryptonites, there were yellow kryptonites, which weren't really like, those weren't good stories as such. Those were just, I think, written to keep the industry alive, to sell the comic books. And I think until and unless the silver age of comic books started, I think comic book found it really hard time finding their feet. And with the starting of the silver age and the age that we call as the Marvel age.
So we had, so as Akash talked about the early days of comics, right? You had Superman,
Yeah,
Batman,
Yeah,
like really a golden age, and that's what they
yeah,
call it as a
yeah,
golden age. And then comic books, it slowly moved away to non-superhero comics. As the world wars got over, people were like again, you understand it. During the world wars, people were
yeah,
like actually excited, or they actually wanted to have entertainment or art which took them out of the world, and that's why those superhero comic books like sold off like hot pancakes, as we say. But then,
yeah,
like when the war got over, the taste of the audience came back to reality, and romance comics, crime comics became much more popular. Again, with the advent of this comic code authority, you can say that you suddenly have superheroes coming back in a big way, because the most other forms of comics were thrown out. Basically, the companies closed down because they
true.
cannot sell their comics anymore.
or they shifted to a different medium. Like they started selling as magazines, which were not under the control of the censorship, right?
And so the Silver Age was an interesting time. So as I said, modernism in art was coming around. We had people like Andy Warhol and all those modern artists, like
True.
changing the way we see art, much more
True.
simplified, much more streamlined. So gone were the capes and all, gone were the you had they wearing their inner wears outside, Superman and Batman. So that
Yeah,
concept of costume designing went out. We needed new superheroes coming in, and so DC had their new Flash, their new Green Lantern, and their Marvel comics had a huge comeback when they came up with comics like Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Doctor Strange,
yeah.
and that
Amazing,
yeah,
amazing fantasy number 15.
Amazing
Spider-Man was
Fantasy number
equally.
15, yes, and there you had Fantastic Four in one. I think so. As you can say, DC started off with DC was very much into the wackiness of the Silver Age, which we call it. So they were showing, as Akash talked about, those red, green, yellow kryptonites, Batman fighting sharks,
Yeah.
and obviously they started losing some sales. It was when Marvel came up with, yeah, they were still, Marvel was still having like books for children, but they actually tried to connect with the audience and have some real human emotions in it, right? And that's why I think Marvel heroes are much more grounded, as you can say. You
Yeah,
had
like
Peter
they have.
Parker, yeah, having a normal teenage boy problems. You had Daredevil, who did not have any powers, was fighting around normal gangsters. So we had those craziness, but the core emotion, the humanity was very much closer to what reality was during that time, and truly the Marvel age blossomed during that time.
Yeah, Stanley and Jack Kirby, like they started out together and they created 90% of the Marvel characters that we know and love today, right? Those were created at that time. And that was a revolutionary time for Marvel, right? When DC was trying to find a way to revamp their already existing superheroes and like restructure them in a way to fit into this new censorship, this new situation. Marvel was going out and creating new stuffs, right? So that was really a great age for Marvel Comics. They created something like Fantastic Four, which was the first known family in the comic book world. Reed Richards and Sue Storm also got married in some issue and they also had a kid. They also found a way to revamp their older superheroes as well, like Namor the Submariner. He was also reintroduced. Captain America was also reintroduced. And I think something very important happened during this time, that was improvement in representation in comic book. Up until now, all the heroes that we had, that be male or female or young or old, all of them were majorly Caucasian males or females, right? But in 1966, Marvel created the first black superhero, Black Panther. Like it was such a time, right? You could not even release a comic book with a black character as a main character. There were a comic called Negro Comics, which had all the characters that were black. I think that was the only black comic available back then. It print published for a few issues, and then it went out of sale.
Apart from that,
Apart
there
from
were
Yeah,
that,
I
there
think it
were
is not only about having black characters, but how you present them, right? So you
exactly
suddenly have Black
exactly.
Panther, who is like, who comes from a very scientifically developed country,
who's a
uh,
king.
who is a king, okay, king of an African nation.
Yeah.
Like I think we have had those, but not been treated as those exotic, tribal. Like whenever we used to imagine Africans
Mm.
in comic books, if we go back to comics like Tarzan, even Phantom, like
Yeah.
you have this white Caucasian males
Mm.
like being left alone in those African jungles and all, and suddenly becoming their kings, right? So that's a
Mm.
white savior, that colonial mindset was
Yeah.
always there. But suddenly you have
That's
Black Panther. He's like he defeats the Fantastic Four in the first issue,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
these are huge statements. Like people were not ready for this, and it is very important, to have kids reading about these things. And I believe that like representation Marvel not only, I think that's why Marvel actually flourished. Not only they brought in real human emotions, but they also tried to tell different kinds of stories.
Yeah, and then there were characters like Luke Cage and Falcon that were introduced, and DC also had to come back with something. Then they introduced Black Lightning, and Images Spawn also came out at that time. That is like one of the best comic book ever written. I think that it was again a mirror of the time that they were in. Like Black Panther was introduced in a Fantastic Four comic, right? He did not he did not get his own comic book in a way that he wasn't the lead in a comic book, right? So I am not saying that there have been introduction to different characters in someone else's comic book that has been happening. Like even now, John Constantine was introduced in a Swamp Thing comic, right, which was written by Alan Moore. Later, he got his own comic book series, Hellblazer, right? So that is okay, but Black Panther was the one of the lead characters of that issue, but even then, it wasn't like promoted as a Fantastic Four versus Black Panther or something like that. Like, so it was different times, but I think art and is something that always is one step ahead of that time, and people look up to it as a source of inspiration. Like today, even today, like with all of this going on around the world, like Black Lives Movement and all, like I think culturally art has always been a very important medium to send a message. Like if you just go about lecturing people, not many will actually listen to you, but if you tell them in a form that is like subtly hidden over a glorified story, I think that drives it more. So that has been happening since ages, right? Like that has been used to spread propaganda as well, right? So I think that was a very important time in the history of comic books when Marvel really came from behind. Like they were nowhere in the picture during the golden age. Like DC started out way before that, but during the silver age with Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and all those names that are almost household names now. They came in and they swept the floor, and like they started creating comics that we still love today. They started creating characters that we still love today. And I think that is also the time when you started relating comic books to something that was meant for kids, like especially with the censorship idea that children shouldn't be exposed to this, right? So I think that is something that we still talk about, right? Is comic book for kids?
First of all, a comic book or a graphic novel, as many people might talk about it, it's just a medium, right? Yeah, it's just a way of telling a story. So, like, it has got unlimited potential, and I think that potential was realized when of course, we had those EC comics as I talked about, showing horror and comics. But even then, they were treated as like indie comics, very underground kind of comics, not very popular. But during the 80s, something happened was like you have this Spider-Man, you have this DC and Marvel comics, but suddenly you have a audience which is growing up, and they're hungry for more. You have new comic book writers coming in, and this is a new breed of comic book writers who have actually grown up by reading comic books. The last generation were fan of pulp heroes of Tarzan
Yeah.
and Mandrake, but this is the first time of having people who have read Superman, Batman, Spider-Man growing up. So they
Yeah.
have grown up with them, and they had revolutionary ideas on how to evolve or how to like change the form of storytelling. And that's the start of the Bronze Age. And that was mainly when I think the mainstream, like even when the comic book fans, the readers realized that comic books can be for adults, can be for like not only for children, and we have very good examples of this. Like Frank Miller came up with the Dark Knight Returns.
Mm.
That was very influential in how we see Batman now.
And I think with the coming of that era of new writers like Neil Adams, George Perez, and Frank Miller, as you rightly said, we had Alan Moore, and we had a generation that stopped caring about the censorship. Like it wasn't a legal mandate, right? It was just an internal censorship that you are putting a stamp that okay, this is suitable for kids, and they basically stopped caring for it, stopped giving a damn about it, and they started printing out whatever material they felt like printing. And they were also selling because people really wanted to read those stories. People wanted to read the stories that were more grounded, that were more relatable, that were more dark and gritty and a reflection of the time that they were in. Like during the 1930s and 40s, with the coming of the superhero generation, there was a sense of awe and amazement that people wanted to explore a world of fantasy, of this larger than life characters. So you had characters like Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Batman, Superman, Captain America, Iron Man. All those characters, those were larger than life. They were super powered characters. But during this Bronze Age, you had characters like Daredevil, you had characters like Batman, you had characters like Dracula, Ghost Rider, and Tales of Zombie, Swamp Thing, all those things that were introduced by legends during this time, like Alan Moore, Frank Miller, that I think really captured the imagination of the audience. Those were really what the audience wanted at that point of time. And I think that is the stage, as you rightly said, is when a comic book changed. The definition of a comic book changed. It was not merely a child's form of entertainment. It became a medium of storytelling, right? Like I think you would agree with me. Any medium, like be it cinema or be it print medium, like a book or a novel, is just a medium. That a medium is not necessarily fixed within a demographic, right? A age demographic or a gender demographic. A medium is just a medium. It is the story that you want to convey through that medium that has a demographic, right? You can tell a kid story that is aimed for a kid. Like if you're reading Diary of a Wimpy Kid, it is aimed for children. But if you're reading something like a book written by Neil deGrasse Tyson or Stephen Hawking, or maybe you're reading Milton Boons, those are meant for young adults. So the content is what determines what age demographic it is meant to be. As you were saying, the start of the Bronze Age started creating stories that were not meant for kids. Like if there was a kid that you have at home and you want to buy him a comic book, you won't buy him a trade paperback of Dark Knight Returns, right? Where Batman is breaking the spine of a gang member in a fighting in a swamp or somewhere. Like you won't hand him that book because that is not meant for him, right? With the Bronze Age, you had events like the death of Gwen Stacy, which was like the first big death in a comic book universe. Up until then, all the stories were like, okay, how strong the opposition is, it doesn't matter. At the end, the hero will find a way to save everyone and come out on top. Good will triumph over evil, and there won't be any losses. That has been the story structure until then. But with that issue of Spider-Man where Gwen Stacy died, I think it was a story in Amazing Spider-Man series. I don't remember the number exactly, where Gwen Stacy was killed by Green Goblin and Peter Parker failed to save him. That showed the readers that the stakes were real. Like there can be death in this world
That
as
there are
well.
Exactly.
real
Everything
consequences
is
to
There are
whatever they're doing.
consequences.
I think, and that's a great way of telling that story. Like a little interesting tidbit about that particular scene. Gary Conway was the writer. He was pretty young during that time, and Spider-Man already had the stamp of Stan Lee. It was very popular that time, and when Gary Conway came up with the story, so Green Goblin basically threw Gwen Stacy from a bridge, and when Spider-Man tried to save her, right, and you would believe that okay, Spider-Man saves the girl, and like everything ends happily ever after. But not only does Gwen dies, but like there are interesting theories, right? When Spider-Man actually shoots the web, and that web gets around Gwen Stacy's neck, so that might be the shock which killed her. So you have these interesting tidbits, like it might be Spider-Man trying to save her, that snap of the neck which killed her.
Yeah.
Okay, so
And
so there are interesting tidbits which you have, and like suddenly you realize ki, oh my god, the implications are very dark, and this is
exactly.
not just a kid story anymore.
if you liked us so far, give us a like, subscribe to our channel, and we'll continue this in the next episode. Thanks for tuning into Fans or Fanatics.